The first question about vendor liability for third parties is, why would the vendor ever be liable for third parties, for the actions of a third party? What we're talking about here is the vendor's own suppliers. And actually, the way this comes up is usually in a clause from the vendor that says the vendor is not liable for the actions of this or that of its suppliers or subcontractors. So let's talk about that clause and its implication and how it makes sense. What I'm talking about here is what I call the ghost player at the table. It's that subcontractor, that supplier to the vendor, like very often the cloud host, the infrastructure host of the vendor's software as a service. It's that player at the table of the negotiations who's actually not there. It's a ghost. It's someone who's actually not negotiating, but the vendor's bringing this ghost into the negotiations by saying things in the contract about it, like we're not going to be liable for their actions. So you can sort of distinguish two different types of suppliers and subcontractors of the vendor. Your tech vendor is going to have lots and lots of its own tech vendors, its own suppliers. If it's providing software, it probably got parts of that software, lots of parts from third parties. It's probably got all sorts of people supporting its ability to provide software as a service. It's got a data center, it's got an infrastructure provider, it's got all kinds of stuff. So there's all kinds of third parties that are involved in the vendor's offering. And the norm is that the vendor is responsible for losses resulting from those third parties' actions. Let's say the software malfunctions, and the malfunction is in something the vendor got from its own supplier. It wrote software, but it includes licensed software from a third party. Under typical terms and with a typical customer, this is not going to make any difference. It's the vendor's product. And I think a customer has a right, it's a legitimate point to say, it's your product, you take care of it. We don't care where the software came from. Or the vendor's providing software as a service, and there's a power outage at the data center where the software is hosted. Again, the customer, it's nothing to do with us. However, there are certain circumstances in which the vendor points to its subcontractor and says, we're not going to be responsible for them. So I gave you the example of the cloud host. So let's say the vendor is hosting technology, the software is the customer is using, probably remote, cloud services on a big hosting platform, infrastructure as a service provided by Google, AWS, whatever it might be. And it's saying, look, this is a well-known provider. Everybody knows its level of reliability. You bought into it knowing what you're getting. We're not taking responsibility. If the software fails, if the software malfunctions as a result of a problem with this third-party provider, we're not responsible. Or maybe the customer asks the vendor to bring in, the vendor provides software as a service, and the customer asks the vendor to add some third party's software as a service to its solution. We want to combine these two and get an API and connect the two, and it's all going to be one solution. The vendor might say, well, okay, but you asked us to do this. We're not taking responsibility for failures for that technology. So that's the concept. It's the ghost player at the table where there's this other party that's involved in the negotiation. And in many cases, the vendor will say, we aren't responsible or liable for that party. What I mostly want to pass on to you is the idea that there are middle roads. Often this leads to a very difficult negotiation. The vendor is saying absolutely no responsibility or liability for this third party, the ghost player. And the vendor is, and the customer is saying total liability. It's your system. This third party is your contractor. We're not in a deal with them. And it can be very hard to resolve. What you got to understand, though, is liability is not the same thing as responsibility. So if the vendor really needs to not take liability for a certain specified type of ghost player, a certain third party, we're not going to be liable for breach, for damages, whatever it is as a result of that party's screw up. That doesn't mean they can't take responsibility for it. And there's a lot of ways you can do that. And what I'm really offering you is compromise solutions to deal with this problem if the two parties, can't settle on either side's position. So you've probably heard of the concept of pass-through promises. The vendor's got warranties and service level agreements and other promises of performance from that third-party provider. And the vendor can promise to the maximum extent that it has the right to do that, it will pass through the benefits of those promises. If the third-party provider promises to give the vendor a fix, the vendor will pass through that fix to the customer's version of the software as a service, whatever it is. So you can make these pass-through promises. It's not as automatic as you might think. I mean, there's a lot of things that the third-party ghost player, the vendor's own supplier, might promise to the vendor that there's no logical way to pass on. Or maybe the third party gives the vendor indemnities, but the indemnity clause doesn't say that the vendor's own customers are included among the indemnified party. Then the vendor has nothing to pass on. Sure, if you're the one making these promises, you want to make sure you can make the pass-through promises. Very often it says, to the extent that we have the right. Let's talk about other sorts of issues, liabilities generated by the third party. What if there's, litigation? What if there's an IP claim related to how the three parties software is interfacing, the two parties, the technology vendor and that ghost player, its own supplier, and it freezes the software in place and the customer can't use it? Maybe the vendor isn't liable, but you could say the vendor is going to do the normal IP remedies. It's going to try and get a license. It's going to try and work around the problem. And if you're on the customer side, you want to say, and if it can't work around it, okay, maybe it's not liable for breach, but we get to terminate. One of the most important things, accepting that the vendor isn't liable shouldn't mean the customer can't terminate, at least if you're on the customer side. If whatever third-party problem, ghost player problem is screwing up delivery of systems you need, you should be able to terminate. You shouldn't have to pay for that. Same with functionality warranties. Whatever the vendor would normally promise to do to try and fix the problem, you can have those promises and you can have the right to terminate. You're just not getting liability for that problem created by the third party. So there are ways to handle this that are compromised. If the problem is a data breach, the vendor's cloud host suffered a data breach and the vendor's disclaiming liability, that one's harder to find. That's harder to get a workaround related to that. It is also, by the way, not out of the question for the vendor to accept broader responsibility and liability related to third-party acts than it gets in its contract from the third party. I'm not saying I recommend it if you're on the vendor side, but the fact that you only get, you've got a small limit of liability from your ghost player host, the host of your software as a service, doesn't mean you can't agree to a higher limit of liability or higher level of service or whatever it is for your own customer. It means that you suffer a loss if you do, but that still might be a reasonable choice. In short, this doesn't need to be all or nothing. Got a variety of different clauses you should think about applying to this issue in the Tech Contracts Handbook, clauses that execute the kinds of concepts I've been giving you, and also at techcontracts.com. So don't think the vendor's either utterly liable and responsible or totally not liable and not responsible. Responsibility and liability aren't the same thing, and there may be ways the customer can get some protection without the vendor giving up its ability to say, we're not liable for what this third party does. That's the issue. If you found this video useful, please come check out Tech Contracts Academy. We provide training on drafting and negotiating contracts about artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and other forms of software. It's all for lawyers, contract managers, and any business people involved with contracts. So please come check out our programs live and on demand at techcontracts.com.